The Volith Collective didn't ask questions when they found new species to exploit. They just took what they wanted and built their empire on the backs of those too weak to fight back. On the edges of charted space, they ran breeding camps, massive facilities where they genetically modified captured species, breaking them down generation by generation until they forgot they were ever free. The goal was simple: create perfect servants, workers who would never rebel, never question, never even think about the word freedom. Kethera 7 was one of their most profitable operations. The planet itself was unremarkable, cold, with twin moons that barely lit the endless night. But the facility sprawled across 300 hectares of reinforced compounds, each section holding a different species at various stages of the breaking process. This is where Overseer Thal had built his career, turning wild, proud beings into docile commodities for the slave markets. It was a routine morning when the alarms went off in the intake sector. Thal was reviewing quarterly production reports when his second-in-command burst into his office, breathing hard. There'd been a crash, he said. Something small. Probably debris from the orbital lanes, but protocol demanded investigation. Thal didn't expect to find anything interesting. Space junk fell from orbit every few months. But when he reached the impact site just beyond the northern perimeter, he stopped cold. It wasn't debris. It was an escape pod, scorched black and cracked open like an egg. Human design, maybe 20 years old, the kind of emergency craft you'd find on colony transport ships. The Volith had complicated relationships with humans. Technically, there was a peace agreement. Officially, humans were off-limits for the breeding programs. But out here, in the lawless zones, rules got flexible. Thal approached carefully, scanning for survivors. The pod's interior was gutted, life support long dead. Frozen blood stained the walls. 2 bodies, both adults, had clearly been dead for days. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a tomb. Crying. Thal found her wrapped in burned fabric, tucked into her emergency supply compartment that had somehow maintained minimal heat. A human infant, maybe 6 months old, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were way too aware for something so small. She looked at him and screamed louder, tiny fists shaking with rage at the cold, at the pain, at being alone. For a moment, Thal considered the simple solution. One quick action and the problem would disappear. Humans were trouble. Even their babies carried that spark of defiance that made them impossible to break properly. But Dr. Venn arrived before he could make that choice. Dr. Venn was the facility's lead geneticist, a Volith who'd spent 40 years studying how to strip species of their inconvenient traits like courage and hope. She took one look at the baby and saw something different than Thal did. She saw research potential. A human raised from infancy in controlled conditions, shaped by their methods from the beginning. What could they learn? What could they create? The debate in the administration tower lasted 3 hours. Most wanted the infant disposed of. Too risky, they argued. Humans had colonial scout networks, military patrols. If anyone discovered they had a human child in a breeding camp, the political fallout would shut down the entire operation. But Dr. Venn was persuasive. The child had no identification, no records they could trace. The escape pod's black box was fried. For all intents and purposes, this baby didn't exist. She could be their secret, their long-term experiment. Thal finally agreed, but with conditions. The human would be logged as specimen KTH-419, nothing more. No special treatment, no acknowledgement of what she was. And if she became a problem, she'd be eliminated immediately. They needed to place her somewhere while she was too young to work. The Myrick pens seemed like the safest choice. The Myrick were a herbivorous species from a high-gravity world, with long necks and gentle dispositions. The Volith had been breeding them for agricultural labor for 3 generations now. They were docile, obedient, and most importantly, their young hatched from eggs in clutches of 20 or 30. What was one more baby among so many? The Myrick nursery keeper, an older female named Shessa, made a soft distressed sound when Dr. Venn placed the crying human infant among her hatchlings. But Shessa didn't refuse. The Myrick had learned never to refuse. She simply gathered the tiny creature close, along with her own young, and hummed a low rumbling song that seemed to calm the baby's screams. That first night, the temperature in the nursery pen dropped below freezing. Standard conditions for Myrick young, whose thick hide protected them. But the human baby had only thin skin and that burned fabric. She cried with a desperation that cut through the darkness. The Myrick hatchlings, barely days old themselves, pressed close around her, sharing their warmth. Shessa curled her long body into a protective circle, keeping the cold at bay. Dr. Venn watched on the security monitors, taking notes. Subject appeared distressed but resilient. Merrick displaying unexpected nurturing behavior toward foreign species. Fascinating. Days became weeks. The baby survived, against all reasonable odds. She drank formula meant for Merrick young, supplemented with whatever nutrients Dr. Venn could synthesize for human biology. She learned to sleep in piles of warm bodies, to recognize Shessa's humming as safety, to grab onto the hatchlings' necks when they moved around the pen. Months became years. The infant grew into a toddler, walking before the Merrick young learned to balance on their 4 legs. She was faster, more curious, constantly getting into areas of the pen that were supposed to be sealed off. The guards started calling her the little pest, because she was always where she shouldn't be. By age 3, she was speaking, not Galactic Common, but the clicking, humming language of the Merrick. She had a name too, though no one remembered who gave it to her first. Katie. Simple, human, defiant. She started using it, insisting on it whenever the guards called her by her specimen number. Dr. Venn continued her observations, but something wasn't going according to plan. The human child wasn't being broken by the system. If anything, she was changing it. The Merrick young who grew up alongside Katie were different from previous generations, more curious, more willing to explore, more likely to question orders. It was subtle, barely measurable, but it was there. Thal wanted to separate them. Dr. Venn argued for patience. This was the experiment, she said. Let it develop. See what happens when you raise a human among beings bred for submission. Either the system would break the human, or they'd learn something valuable about human resilience. Either way, they'd gain useful data. 16 years passed in the cold night of Cathara 7. The baby who'd arrived in a burned escape pod grew tall and strong, working alongside the Merrick in the nursery sectors, speaking their language, singing their songs. She had Shessa's gentle patience and something else, something the Merrick had lost generations ago. She had her mother's fire, burning quiet and careful in the dark. Katie turned 16 the same week the Vorlith expanded the southern compounds. She didn't know her actual birthday, so she'd picked a day at random years ago, marked it on a scratched piece of metal she kept hidden, and that was good enough. Birthdays didn't mean much in a breeding camp anyway. What mattered was whether you could work, whether you followed orders, whether you'd been broken enough to forget you were ever meant for something better. Katie remembered everything, though. That was her problem, according to the guards. She remembered the stories Shessa used to hum in the old Merrick tongue, stories about their homeworld where the grass grew tall as trees and the sky turned 7 colors at dawn. She remembered the day a young tailor whispered his grandmother's name before the guards dragged him to reconditioning. She remembered every species that passed through these pens, every language, every fragment of the cultures the Vorlith tried so hard to erase. The facility had grown massive over the years. 12 different species now filled the compounds, over 2,000 individuals at various stages of the breaking process. Katie worked the nursery sectors, the job Dr. Venn had assigned her when she was old enough to be useful. Officially, she fed the young ones, cleaned their pens, monitored their health metrics. Unofficially, she did something far more dangerous. She taught them to remember. It started small. A Merrick hatchling would ask why the sky was always dark, and Katie would whisper about planets with suns, about daylight that lasted for hours, about warmth that didn't come from heat lamps. A young tailor would cry for his mother, and Katie would sit with him through the night, teaching him the 3 words of his people's language she'd learned from others. Little pieces of truth, scattered like seeds in rocky soil. The network grew slowly, carefully. Katie learned to move between sectors during shift changes, those brief windows when the security monitors cycled through their resets. She'd slip messages written on scraps of food packaging, using a code she developed based on 6 different languages mixed together. Nothing the Vorlith could easily translate, nothing that would trigger their content scanners. The messages were simple. The Krenth came from a world of ice and honor. The Sholak wrote poetry that made their gods weep. Your people built cities in the clouds. Small reminders that everyone here came from somewhere else, that they'd been something before they became property. Dr. Venn was old now, her scales faded and movements slow. She still ran the research division, but she'd developed a strange relationship with her oldest test subject. She'd sneak Katie human food sometimes, real proteins, not the processed nutrient paste, and old data tablets with Earth literature loaded on them. Katie devoured everything. Shakespeare, Angelou, Hemingway, writers whose names meant nothing out here but whose words carried weight. Dr. Venn never explained why she did it. Maybe it was scientific curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Katie never asked, just took what was offered and shared what she could with others. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which was ironic because Katie had been thinking it was actually a pretty good day. She'd successfully taught a group of young Sholak a children's song in their ancestral tongue, something about starlight and home. They'd been humming it quietly in their pen, careful to stop when guards passed. But one of them, a kid named Ren who couldn't have been more than 8, got excited and kept singing during afternoon inspection. Guard Commander Vrel heard it. He was new to the facility, transferred in from a military outpost, and he ran the compounds like a prison yard. He grabbed Ren by the arm, demanding to know where he'd learned that song. The kid, terrified, looked right at Katie. Vrel dragged them both to the processing center. That's what they called the reconditioning facility, like using a clean word would make it less horrible. Katie had never been inside, but she'd seen plenty come out, empty-eyed, docile, everything that made them unique burned away by whatever they did in there. Vrel threw Ren against the wall and activated the neural suppression field. The kid started screaming immediately, that high-pitched sound of someone whose mind was being forcibly rewritten. Katie didn't think. She just moved. 16 years of watching Vorlith guards, learning their patterns, studying their weaknesses. She knew Vrel kept his shock baton on his left hip because he was right-hand. She knew he'd turn toward a threat instead of calling for backup first because he was arrogant. She knew exactly how much force a human could generate compared to a Vorlith. She hit him in the throat first, collapsing his air passage. While he choked, she grabbed his arm and twisted, feeling bones snap in 3 distinct places. The baton fell. Katie caught it and smashed the control panel for the neural field. Ren collapsed, sobbing but aware, still himself. The alarm started screaming a second later. Facility-wide lockdown. Unauthorized violence. Security breach. Katie pulled Ren to his feet and ran, her mind racing through options. There weren't many. The compounds were designed to be inescapable. 30-foot walls, energy barriers, armed guards at every checkpoint. She'd studied them all, mapped every weakness, but always as a theoretical exercise. She'd never actually planned to run. They made it to the central yard before the guards caught up. 20 Vorlith in full tactical gear, weapons raised, surrounding them. Thal himself walked out, looking more annoyed than angry. He ordered Katie to her knees. She pushed Ren behind her and stood taller instead. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't make sense. Humming. Low and rumbling, the Myrick comfort song Shessa used to sing. But it wasn't just coming from the Myrick pens. The Taylor were clicking in rhythm. The Sholak were adding their harmonic tones. Even the Krenth, the aggressive predator species that usually fought among themselves, had gone completely silent in solidarity. Every pen. Every species. 2,000 voices joining together in a song Katie had taught them, a song about remembering who you were. Thal's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. Dr. Venn appeared at his shoulder, saying something urgent Katie couldn't hear. The guards looked nervous, weapons wavering. This had never happened before. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Katie met Thal's eyes and smiled. She'd already won, and they both knew it. They could kill her, recondition her, erase her. But she'd planted something they couldn't dig out. She'd given 2,000 beings a reason to hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing in a place built on breaking spirits. They dragged Katie to solitary confinement as the songs continued echoing across the compounds. Ren was pulled away crying, but he was whole, still himself. Katie counted that as a victory as they sealed her in the darkness. She'd always known it would end like this. She just hoped to last a little longer. The songs didn't stop. Even through the thick walls, Katie could hear them. Her family, singing her home. The solitary cell was 3 meters square, solid metal walls, no windows, no light except the dim strip along the floor that never turned off. They'd thrown Katie in without ceremony, sealed the door, and left her alone with the certainty that she wouldn't be leaving alive. The Vorlith didn't tolerate violence against their guards. The punishment for what she'd done to Vrel was execution, probably public, definitely painful. Katie sat in the corner and tried not to think about it. She counted her breaths instead, an old meditation technique she'd read about in one of Dr. Venn's smuggled tablets. Some Earth philosopher had written that fear was just your body preparing for action, and if you controlled your breathing, you controlled the fear. It wasn't really working, but it gave her something to focus on besides the waiting. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time got weird in the dark. They fed her once, sliding a tray through a slot in the door. Nutrient paste, water, nothing else. Katie ate it anyway, forcing herself to stay strong even though she knew it probably didn't matter. Old habits were hard to break. She tried to sleep but the songs kept her awake. Even through the thick walls, even from whatever distant part of the facility they'd stashed her in, She could hear them. Faint, but constant. The Myrick humming, the tailor clicking, the Sholak harmonizing. They hadn't stopped. That realization hit Katie harder than anything else. In 16 years, she'd never seen the different species work together. They were kept separate, categorized, deliberately isolated to prevent exactly this kind of unity. But they were unified now. Because of her. Because she taught them they were more than what the Vorlith said they were. On what Katie guessed was the third day, the door opened. Bright light flooded in, making her eyes water. 2 guards hauled her out and dragged her toward the administration tower. Katie's legs were weak from sitting, but she forced herself to walk upright. If this was the end, she'd face it standing. The conference room was full. Thal sat at the head of the table, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Dr. Venn was there, along with the facility's financial controller and several faces Katie didn't recognize. Security feeds covered one entire wall, showing live footage from every compound. What Katie saw made her breath catch. The pens were silent. Not the silence of sleep or submission, but the silence of deliberate choice. The Myrick weren't eating. The tailor weren't moving. The Sholak sat in meditation postures, completely still. Even the Krenth, who were usually aggressive and territorial, had organized themselves into calm, watching groups. No violence. No chaos. Just absolute, total refusal to cooperate. The first unified work stoppage in Vorlith breeding camp history. Thal stood when he saw Katie, his face twisted with rage. What did you do to them? Katie almost laughed. After 16 years, they still didn't get it. I didn't do anything. They're making their own choice. They don't make choices. Thal slammed his hand on the table. They're products. Commodities. They follow orders. Apparently not anymore, Dr. Venn said quietly. She was studying the monitors with something that might have been pride. The Myrick haven't eaten in 72 hours. The tailor are refusing all commands. Productivity has dropped to 0 across all sectors. We're losing approximately 200,000 credits per day. The financial controller, a nervous Vorlith named Drex, pulled up more data. It's worse than that. We have contracts, delivery deadlines. If we can't fulfill orders, we'll face penalties. And if word gets out that we've lost control of the facility. He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what happened to breeding camps that couldn't maintain order. The collective shut them down and reassigned the staff to far less comfortable positions. Execute the human, Thal said flatly. Public display. Show them what happens when they forget their place. That won't work. Dr. Venn manipulated the screen, pulling up analysis charts. I've been monitoring their behavior. This isn't a typical response to leadership loss. They're not following Katie because she's dominant or because they fear her. It's something else. Something we didn't account for. What? Thal demanded. Dr. Venn looked at Katie for a long moment. Loyalty. Genuine, chosen loyalty. If we kill her, they won't submit. They'll become completely unmanageable. We could be looking at mass casualties, total facility loss. The room went quiet. Katie kept her expression neutral, but inside, her heart was racing. She hadn't planned this. She'd taught them songs and stories, given them pieces of their histories, but she'd never imagined they'd risk everything for her. The weight of it was crushing and beautiful at the same time. Drex cleared his throat. There might be an alternative. The Galactic Research Council has been requesting human subjects for cognitive studies. They're offering substantial compensation. We could donate the specimen to their program. Get her off-world, claim we're cooperating with legitimate scientific research. And the others? Thal asked. Once she's gone, we increase the reconditioning schedules. Wipe the last few months from their memories, start fresh. It'll be expensive, but less expensive than total facility failure. Katie felt cold. They were talking about erasing everything she'd built, everyone she'd reached. Ren would forget the song. The Myrick would forget their homeworld stories. All of it, gone like it never happened. But she'd be alive. She'd be off Kethra 7, away from this nightmare. Part of her, the part that had survived 16 years in hell, whispered that she should take it. Save herself. She'd done what she could. Then she looked at the monitors again. At Shessa, sitting quietly in the Myrick pen, her long neck curved in the protective posture she used to use when Katie was small. At Ren, barely visible in the tailor section, his young face set with determination. At hundreds of beings who'd found courage because one human girl had told them they deserved to remember. Thal was talking to the guards, giving orders for her transport preparation. Dr. Venn caught Katie's eye and gave the smallest nod, like she was saying goodbye. Or maybe apologizing. Katie would never know which. They took her to the landing pad at dawn. Kethera 7's twin moons were setting, and for once, the perpetual night was broken by a sliver of light from the distant sun. Katie walked between her guards, wrists bound, heading toward a transport that would take her away from the only home she'd ever known. The route passed the main compounds. As they walked, Katie saw them. Every pen, every species, pressed against the barriers, watching. No one made a sound, but every eye followed her. Katie stopped walking, forcing the guards to stop too. She looked at her family, all of them, and pressed her hand to her heart. Then she spread her palm outward, fingers wide. Courage. The gesture she'd taught them meant courage. The Myrick began to hum. Low and gentle, Shessa's lullaby, the one she'd sung to a crying human baby 16 years ago. The tailor added their clicking rhythm. The Sholak joined with harmonics that made the air vibrate. Species that had never worked together, that had been deliberately kept apart for generations, singing in perfect unity. Katie climbed into the transport with tears on her face and her head held high. The guards sealed the door, and the engines fired up. As they lifted off, Katie pressed her hand against the small window, watching Kethera 7 fall away below her. She didn't know it yet, but the songs didn't stop when she left. They kept singing for days, then weeks. And in the darkest corners of the pens, in whispered conversations the monitors couldn't catch, a new idea began to spread. If they could stand together for one human, what else could they do together? The answer to that question would burn across the sky soon enough. The transport was a standard cargo hauler, the kind used to move equipment between facilities. Katie sat in the back compartment, hands still bound, with two guards watching her from the front seats. They weren't taking chances. The flight to the research facility would take 6 hours, crossing 3 sectors of space. 6 hours for Katie to think about everything she was leaving behind. Except she wasn't planning to leave anything behind. Katie had spent 16 years watching the Vorlith. She'd memoized their patterns, their procedures, their weaknesses. She knew that cargo transports only carried 2 guards because they were considered low-risk assignments. She knew the guards got lazy after the first hour, once they were clear of the planet and convinced their prisoner wasn't a threat. She knew the restraints they used were designed for Vorlith physiology, not human. Most importantly, she knew exactly how much force it took to break a Vorlith's concentration. She waited until they'd been in flight for 90 minutes. Both guards had relaxed, one of them actually dozing while the other checked his data pad. Katie had been working her wrists the entire time, using the flexibility of human joints to create slack in the restraints. Not enough to slip free, but enough to move. When she stood up, the awake guard barely had time to look surprised before Katie drove her shoulder into his chest. Vorlith bones were dense but their respiratory systems were vulnerable to impact. He went down gasping. The second guard fumbled for his weapon, but Katie was already moving. She'd spent years watching them draw their shock batons, knew exactly where they kept them, exactly how long it took to activate. She was faster. The fight lasted maybe 20 seconds. Katie didn't try to kill them, just incapacitate. She used pressure points, joint locks, techniques she'd learned from reading Earth martial arts manuals on Dr. Venn's tablets and practicing in secret for years. When both guards were unconscious, she zip-tied them with their own restraints and dragged them to the storage compartment. The cockpit was simple, designed for automated flight with manual override options. Katie slid into the pilot's seat and stared at the controls. She'd never actually flown anything before, but she'd watched, always watched. The Vorlith used standardized systems across all their vessels. Nav controls on the left, propulsion on the right, autopilot override in the center. Katie took a deep breath and killed the autopilot. Alarms immediately started screaming. The transport's AI demanded authentication codes, threatened to alert Central Command, warned that unauthorized course changes would result in immediate interception. Katie ignored all of it and grabbed the manual controls, turning the ship in a wide arc. She wasn't running away. She was going back. The return flight to Kethera 7 took 3 hours. Katie spent that time searching the transport systems, pulling every file she could access. Guard schedules, facility layouts, shipping manifests. The guards' personal data pads were a treasure trove of information, security codes, communication protocols, even personal messages complaining about working conditions. Katie downloaded everything to a small data chip she found in the emergency supplies. When Kethera 7 appeared on the view screen, Katie aimed the transport directly at the facility's main communication array. The structure was massive, a tower bristling with satellite dishes and transmission equipment. It was how the Vorlith coordinated operations across the planet, how they reported to the collective, how they maintained control. Katie set the autopilot to collision course, grabbed the data chip and an emergency supply pack, and headed for the escape pod. She launched 30 seconds before impact, the small pod shooting away from the transport as it plowed into the communication tower in a spectacular explosion. Debris rained across the compound. Alarms shrieked. Chaos erupted below. Katie's pod crashed in the wilderness 3 kilometers from the facility. She crawled out bruised and bleeding but alive, and immediately started running. Not away from the compound, but parallel to it, heading north. The Vorlith would expect her to flee into the deep wilderness. They'd send search parties in that direction, sweeping outward in expanding circles. Katie was going somewhere else entirely. 16 years of listening to Dr. Ven's stories, of reading old facility reports on smuggled tablets, had taught Katie about Kethra 7's history. Before the Vorlith built their breeding camps, the planet had been a terraforming prospect. An Earth-based corporation had started atmospheric processing, built preliminary infrastructure, then abandoned the project when they found more profitable worlds. The terraforming station still existed, 200 kilometers north, derelict but potentially functional. Katie ran through that first day and night, pushing her body beyond exhaustion. The Vorlith had air patrols searching for her, their scanners sweeping the terrain. She hid in rocky outcroppings when they passed overhead, covered herself in mud to mask her heat signature, kept moving whenever it was clear. She ate from the emergency pack, rationing carefully. Drank from ice pools, melting the frozen water in her hands. Slept in 2-hour bursts, always ready to run. Her body screamed for rest but Katie pushed harder. Every kilometer she covered was one closer to the goal. The Vorlith patrols intensified on day 4. They'd figured out she wasn't just running. They'd calculated possible destinations and the terraforming station was on their list. Katie saw aircraft circling the area ahead, searching. She had to move faster. She traveled the last 50 kilometers in a single brutal march, 20 hours of continuous movement. When she finally saw the station rising from the frozen plains, she almost cried with relief. Then she saw the Vorlith patrol ship landing near the entrance and knew she'd have to fight for it. But Katie had learned something important in 16 years. You didn't always win by being stronger. Sometimes you won by being willing to sacrifice more than your enemy expected. She circled around the patrol, used a rocky ridge to approach the station from an angle they weren't watching. Found a maintenance hatch half buried in ice and forced it open with bleeding hands. Dropped into darkness and ran through corridors that hadn't seen life in 20 years, following emergency lighting that somehow still functioned. The central control room was exactly where the old schematic said it would be. Katie used Dr. Ven's access codes, praying the old scientist hadn't reported them stolen. The system flickered, hesitated, then granted access. Katie pulled up the long-range communications array and started uploading. Everything she'd taken from the transport. Everything she'd memoized over 16 years. Facility locations, genetic trafficking records, the names and origins of 12 enslaved species. She broadcast it on every frequency she could access, directed it to the Galactic Coalition, to independent news networks, to human colonial authorities. Then she recorded one final message. Her hands were shaking as she spoke into the camera, exhausted and terrified but absolutely certain. My name is Katie. I'm human. I was raised in a Vorlith breeding camp on Kethra 7 for 16 years. What you're seeing are the coordinates and complete records of their operation. 12 species are being held there, stripped of their cultures, bred for slavery. They need help. They need someone to care. She paused, thinking of Shessa, of Ren, of everyone still in those pens. In 3 days, when Kethra 7's moons align, the facility's power grid will cycle for maintenance. Security will be at minimum. I've included detailed instructions for a coordinated uprising, written in 12 languages. If anyone receives this, please help them. They deserve to go home. Katie signed off simply. From Katie, daughter of Earth and Kethra. She hit send and watched the transmission counter climb. The message was spreading across communication networks, bouncing through relays, reaching farther than the Vorlith could possibly stop. Outside, she heard the patrol breaking through the station doors. Katie smiled, downloaded one copy of everything to her data chip, and prepared to run one more time. The sky over Kethra 7 would burn soon enough. She just had to survive long enough to see it. Katie's message reached the Galactic Coalition headquarters on Proxima Station approximately 4 hours after transmission. It took another 2 hours for analysts to verify the data wasn't a hoax. By hour 7, emergency sessions were being convened across 36 government chambers. By hour 12, the story had broken on every major news network in civilized space. By hour 24, the galaxy was on fire with outrage. The footage Katie had included was damning. Not just dry statistics or facility layouts, but actual security recordings she'd pulled from the transport's database. Video of hatchlings being separated from parents. Audio of reconditioning sessions. Medical logs detailing genetic modifications performed on unwilling subjects. The Volith had documented their own crimes with bureaucratic thoroughness, never imagining it would be used against them. Human colonial authorities were among the first to respond. The discovery that a human child had been held and exploited for 16 years triggered protocols that hadn't been used since the Frontier Wars. Within 36 hours, 3 human naval vessels were en route to Kethra 7, authorized to use whatever force necessary to secure the release of their citizen. But they weren't alone. The Myrick homeworld government, which had been searching for their lost colony ship for 20 years, mobilized their defense fleet. The Taylor Confederacy declared the breeding camps an act of war. Even species that didn't have members in the facility joined the response, horrified by the implications of what the Volith had built. On Kethra 7, Katie watched all of this unfold from her hiding spot in the deep wilderness. She'd escaped the patrol at the terraforming station by triggering an emergency pressure release that flooded 3 corridors with freezing gas. By the time they'd cleared it, she was gone, running through maintenance tunnels that led out to the frozen plains. She'd found shelter in a cave system 10 kilometers from the facility and hacked into the Volith communication network using equipment she'd salvaged. Her body was exhausted, running on adrenaline and stubbornness, but she couldn't rest yet. The uprising was scheduled for the new moon, still 2 days away. She had to make sure the people in those pens were ready. Inside the facility, everything was falling apart. Thal had ordered complete lockdown after Katie's transmission went public, but that only made things worse. The species in the compounds had heard the message. Katie had broadcast it on internal frequencies too, making sure everyone knew help was coming. Making sure they knew the exact moment to act. Dr. Venn had been placed under arrest, accused of helping Katie access classified information. She sat in a detention cell, watching the security feeds with grim satisfaction. She'd enabled this, in her own way. Those smuggled tablets, those access codes she'd pretended not to notice Katie memorizing. 40 years she'd spent breaking beings down, and in the end, one human child had shown her what she'd really been destroying. The night before the new moon, Coalition vessels began arriving in orbit. Human warships positioned themselves in a defensive grid, not attacking but making their presence absolutely clear. Myrick transports flanked them. Taylor cruisers. Sholak medical ships. 12 different species, united for the first time anyone could remember, all demanding the same thing: release the prisoners. The Volith Collective's response was predictable. They claimed sovereignty, insisted the coalition had no jurisdiction, threatened war if their facilities were breached. They deployed their own fleet, outdated military vessels that had been gathering dust in orbital stations. The standoff was tense, weapons hot on both sides, diplomats screaming at each other over secure channels. Nobody noticed what was happening on the ground. Katie's instructions had been specific. Wait for the power cycle. Wait for the moment when security systems reset and guards were at minimum staffing. Then move together, every species at once, overwhelming the reduced patrols through sheer numbers. No violence unless absolutely necessary. Just coordination, just unity. When Kethra 7's twin moons aligned and the facility's generators cycled down for their scheduled maintenance, 2,000 beings moved as one. The Myrick, gentle and supposedly docile, formed protective circles around the young and the weak. The Taylor, quick and clever, disabled lock mechanisms using techniques they'd been quietly sharing for weeks. The Sholak used their natural vocal abilities to jam communication systems with harmonic interference. Even the Krenth, the predator species everyone feared, channeled their aggression into breaking down barriers and creating escape routes. The guards were overwhelmed in minutes. Not by violence, but by organized resistance on a scale they'd never imagined possible. Beings who were supposed to be broken, who'd been bred for submission, reclaiming their agency one pen at a time. Katie emerged from the wilderness when she saw the first groups reaching the outer compounds. She ran toward them, her family, and they ran toward her. Shessa reached her first, that long neck curving down to touch Katie's forehead in the Myrick gesture of deepest affection. Ren crashed into her legs, crying and laughing at the same time. That's where the human rescue team found them 20 minutes later. Lieutenant Hayes had been prepared for hostages, for traumatized victims cowering in locked cells. Instead she found liberated beings working together, guards peacefully restrained with their own equipment, and Dr. Venn coordinating the surrender of remaining Vorlith personnel. And in the middle of it all, one human girl, scarred and thin and absolutely unbroken, surrounded by hundreds of beings who looked at her like she'd hung the moons. Hayes had read the reports, watched the videos, but seeing it in person was different. "Katie?" she asked carefully. Katie looked up, and Hayes saw something in those eyes that made her chest tight. Not trauma, though that was there too. Not fear. It was determination, fierce and unshakable, the kind that came from surviving the impossible and deciding to make sure nobody else had to. "We need medical teams," Katie said, her voice hoarse but steady. "The young ones especially. And translators. 12 species, they all need to contact their homeworlds. Can you help with that?" Hayes found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to respond. Yeah, we can do that." The Vorlith Collective made one last attempt to maintain control. Their fleet commander demanded the immediate return of all property, and threatened to fire on coalition vessels. The human admiral's response was broadcast on open channels so everyone could hear it. "These aren't property. They're people. And if you fire a single shot, you'll find out exactly how seriously humans take the protection of our own." The Vorlith fleet backed down. They had superior numbers but they were facing unified opposition from dozens of species. The political calculus was simple: they couldn't win this fight, not militarily, not diplomatically, not morally. The sky over Kethera 7 lit up that night, but not with weapons fire. It blazed with the engine burns of transport ships from a dozen different nations, vessels arriving to reclaim their people. Katie stood in the compound yard, watching shuttles descend like falling stars, and felt something she'd never experienced before. Hope. Real, tangible hope that things could actually get better. The process of returning everyone home took weeks. Katie worked as a translator, helping traumatized beings communicate with rescue workers, explaining cultural contexts that might otherwise be missed. She barely slept, running on determination and the knowledge that this was what mattered. This was what she'd survived 16 years for. When reporters asked why she'd risked everything, Katie's answer was simple. "They sang me lullabies when I cried. They kept me warm when I was cold. That's what family does. You protect each other." The Vorlith Collective collapsed within 6 months, torn apart by sanctions, internal revolts, and criminal prosecutions. Breeding camps across 24 worlds were liberated. Thousands of beings found their way home, carrying with them stories of a human girl who taught them to remember, to hope, to fight back. Katie returned to Earth only once, for a memorial service. They'd found records of her parents, colony transport pilots who died getting her to that escape pod. She buried a piece of her mother's burned fabric under an oak tree in Montana and said goodbye to people she'd never really known. Then she went back to Kethera 7, where something new was being built. Not a breeding camp, not a prison, but a settlement founded on principles the galaxy had never really tried before. A place where different species lived together by choice, building something nobody could quite define yet but everyone recognized as important. Shessa was there, too old to make the journey back to the Myrick homeworld but content to stay where her daughter was. Because that's what Katie had become, officially adopted through Myrick customs. Ren stayed too, choosing Katie's family over his distant relatives. They were joined by others, beings who'd found something in that shared struggle that meant more than genetic heritage. The settlement grew slowly, carefully, with help from a dozen worlds and oversight from coalition authorities. They called it Haven, simple and true. Katie helped design the educational systems, making sure every child learned their own species' history alongside everyone else's. Making sure nobody ever forgot where they came from or what they'd survived together. Years later, when diplomats asked Katie to speak at the Galactic Assembly about her experience, she stood before representatives of hundreds of worlds and told them the truth. "I didn't save anyone. We saved each other. That's what people do when you give them the chance. They choose kindness. They choose family. They choose hope. Every single time." The sky over Kethera 7 still burned some nights, but now it was the warm glow of a settlement full of life, of laughter, of beings who'd learned that the strongest bonds weren't forged in genetics or conquest, but in the simple choice to care for each other. Katie stood beneath those burning skies, surrounded by her impossible family, and knew she was finally home.